Everyone, and welcome to Pagan Happy Hour. As you can see, I'm trying out a new background. It was just such a lovely day today that I wanted to try doing Pagan Happy Hour here on my screened-in porch. But do keep me updated if you can't hear me okay, because I am living in the city, so it could get a bit noisy from time to time. But thank you all so much for joining me today. Now, especially because I'm doing Pagan Happy Hour a day early this week since I have an event on Friday. But thank you all, who sticking in, tuning in, having a drink, and having a good chat. So here's the plan. Today, we are going to be talking about the concept of time from a pagan perspective. Now, that sounds kind of philosophical or esoteric, and I think it is going to be a conversation like that. So I do hope you have a drink ready. This conversation could go in a number of different directions, but basically, we'll be looking at how pagan societies measured time in a variety of different pagan civilizations. We'll be looking at the tools they used, and in general, what was their relationship to the concept of time. We'll be also looking at things like planetary days and hours and how people approached those ideas. And then ultimately, we'll be contrasting that to what I'm calling, and I've heard other people call, machine time or clock time. Basically, the system of timekeeping that we all live under now. So that is the plan for today. And if you are new here, welcome. Pagan Happy Hour is just a great opportunity for us pagans and witches to connect, to discuss ideas, to share resources with each other. It's something I've been doing for a little over a year now. And if you do enjoy the show and would like to support it, there are a couple different ways you can do that. Firstly, through my Patreon, which I have linked down below. And if you do choose to join the Patreon, you also gain access to my Discord community, which is a really great place to just chat with fellow pagans, to find a great community of like-minded people. And the other great way you can support the show is through the Super Chats feature, which is the $ button at the bottom of the chat. Through that button, you can donate any amount, and I will see your question or comment pop up really big for me. And I'll be sure to bring your thoughts and your ideas into the conversation. And of course, as we are going along, I'm going to be looking over here. I will be looking at the chat so I can bring in as many of your thoughts and ideas into the conversation. Now that we got that out of the way, can you please in the chat tell me can you please tell me where you are watching from today and what you happen to be drinking? Let me cue that drink music. Okay, let's see. We have some people chiming in from San Francisco, Washington, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Chicago, England, Canada, Germany, New York, Hawaii, let's see, Arkansas, Southern Ontario, Miami, Kansas City, Illinois, Michigan, and that's a lot of states to list off right away. Oh, we also have Alabama here. So thank you guys so much for joining me, and continue to chat in the chat as we go along, as we begin our discussion. Now today I'm just having a simple white wine because it's a lovely 80 degrees right now, if you could believe it, here in Savannah, Georgia. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about time. Kind of a deep topic, but let's see how it goes. Okay, I'm turning off that drink music, and we will get into it. So the first thing I want to discuss is, what is a pagan concept of time? Now, this is just kind of a phrase I'm inventing in the moment, right? But I think you kind of know what I'm going after here. Because for the vast majority of human existence, we humans have been around for millennia. We approached time in a very different way than we approach it now, ever since clocks were basically invented. But our pagan ancestors and pagan civilizations throughout the millennia tended to look at time more based on a series of cycles and much more attuned to the natural world. So, of course, the first cycle you might think of is the cycle of sunrise and sunset. This is something we all naturally, intuitively understand. It is in our bones. We know that we wake up with the sun, we live our days while the sun is out. And then when the sun sets, that is the time to go indoors. That is the time to rest and sleep. So, that natural cycle of sunrise and sunset is something that people have lived their lives around for millennia. Now, that's not necessarily the way we live our lives today. We don't always wake up with the sun and go to bed with the sun. But because most ancient civilizations were formulated around an agricultural system and a need with the land, that's kind of the system the vast majority of people operated under. So that's one big cycle: sunrise, sunset, when you work, when you rest, when you sleep. Another big cycle is the wheel of the year itself. And the wheel of the year is something that we've talked about quite a bit here on Pagan Happy Hour, and I've talked about in a few different videos on my channel as well. I recommend checking out the video I did on pagan cycles, but you can see this in many videos I've discussed where I talk about different pagan holidays. And all of these holidays are mostly tied to the agricultural calendar. Paganism, of course, is so much about getting in tune with the natural world and the natural cycles. And so many of our ancient festivals and holidays were based on key moments in the Wheel of the Year. Sometimes those moments were based on the movement of the sun, or the shortest day and the longest day, or the equal days. So that would be the solstices and the equinoxes. Or sometimes it was simply based on what people were doing agriculturally at the time and what livestock needed to be harvested at certain times of the year, what needed to be preserved, what needed to be sown, and what needed to be harvested. So much of pagan ideas around time are based around this wheel of the year and the agricultural seasonality of life. Something that we are very much, I think, removed from in our daily existence. Unless you happen to be a farmer or happen to be really into gardening, you probably aren't super attuned to those cycles of the agricultural year. And one of the things I'm really excited about as I now have some garden space myself is starting to reestablish that connection so that, like my pagan ancestors, I'm more aware of when is the time to sow the seeds, when is the time to harvest, when is the time to reap the rewards of that harvest, all connecting me back to a more pagan-centric view of time. But let me check your comments here. Let me know if you have anything to note on these ideas of ancient peoples operating their lives around sunrise and sunset, the wheel of the year, and the agricultural season. Let me see what you guys have to say. Oh, Graves has a really interesting comment here. He says that pagan faiths being on the cycle of the year is more tied to that measurement, this cyclical nature, while historic religions are based on an event that happened in the past to cause them to do something. That's interesting. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you look at our main monotheistic religions. Their festival days, their celebrations are based on something that happened, right? Jesus died, resurrected, things like that. Saints died. These are events that occurred from a human, And that created the notation in the Wheel of the Year, the holiday, the event to celebrate. Whereas pagan holidays are pretty much entirely based on not human events occurring, but on natural cycles and animals and plants and the harvest and the agricultural season. That's a really good point. Let's see. Olivia says, one of the things I love about being pagan is the cyclical sense of time that it brings, versus being purely linear like most of modern culture. Yes, definitely. That's a huge benefit in my view as well. I really love looking at things in that cyclical way. Let's see. Emily says, I became super aware of the cycle of the seasons when I started birding. Yes, so paying attention to birds or paying attention to plants blooming at certain times of the year. Anything you can do that's going to get you outside and start noticing the changes in the wheel of the year is going to ultimately bring a layer of depth to your pagan practice. Let's see. Okay. Interesting comment here from Wandering Dog that says, I feel record keeping made a significant change in how we perceive time. Marking things after events, as in BC or AD, dictate whether we view time as linear or non-linear. That's a neat point. And yeah, I mean, that whole concept of the timeline where it's split into BC or AD, before Christ, after Christ, or if you want to go with the modern term BCE and CE, before Common Era and Common Era, is quite strange. It really does show you how effective Christianity was at converting the vast majority of the world. And I still find it kind of bizarre that, continents like Asia and Africa that, well, yes, there was Christian conversion, but they still go with that BC AD system. I'm surprised that everyone is kind of rebelling against it. Of course, you do have other calendars layered on top of that. I know there's a lot of lunar year, kind of lunar calendar representation and holidays in Asia. But yeah, there's a really funny Louis C.K. skit from, like 7 or 8 years ago. He talks about how bizarre it is that we have split the timeline into BC and AD, and why that kind of ultimately doesn't make sense. So look that up if you're interested. Okay. So now we talked about how these kind of ancient civilizations, pagan cultures, were measuring time mostly through sunrise, sunset, wheel of the year, agricultural seasons, etc. Now, that doesn't mean that was the only way of telling time. Certain civilizations did have some unique ways to do this that are slightly akin to how we do it now. The Egyptians actually used their obelisks as kind of a sundial. Now, it wouldn't be a exact measurement of time, but it would do a pretty good job. So the ancient Egyptians had this sundial method. They kind of first invented that. And the Greeks definitely improved on the sundial method. And the Romans developed additional methods. While they still used sundials, they also had a water clock system that they invented, which used a container that you would put at a very slight slope, and the container had markings. So as the water would slowly run out, you could check the markings to kind of tell the time. And that was useful because you could still tell time when it was cloudy out and your sundials weren't working. These types of water clocks were improved upon by Christians later on. Eventually we had pendulum clocks and then kind of our regular clock. So that's kind of the general system or the general history of timekeeping. But what's interesting about, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans that had these timekeeping devices, they weren't used by the general populace at all. They were mostly used by priests or, members of the ruling elite. So even though they had these kind of slightly more advanced timekeeping methods, they weren't widely adopted or used. Still, the vast majority of people were measuring time through these natural cycles and the natural cycle of sunrise and sunset. So I do have a podcast that I linked down below in the description that does talk a bit more about kind of pagan time versus machine time. And it goes into a bit more detail on these kinds of topics. So check that out if you're interested. But let me see what you guys have to say. Uhtred is asking if I've heard of Graham Hancock. Yes, I have. I've read some of his books. He has some interesting ideas. Don't agree with everything he says, but I think there's a lot of wisdom there. Tama in the comments says, I find it interesting that if you want good health, one of the recommendations doctors will give you is to eat foods in season. That's interesting. I wonder, almost on a metaphysical or spiritual level, eating foods that would be naturally growing at that time of year somehow imparts kind of a layer of health that you wouldn't get normally. That's really interesting. Let's see. Mighty Sarlacc in the comments is asking, does China use a different calendar using animals for the year? So that's kind of a separate system. That's the zodiac. So, obviously in the Western, the Greco-Roman zodiacal system, that's based on the month you were born. In Chinese zodiac, it's based on the year you were born. So if you want to look up your Chinese zodiac sign, you just type in what year you were born. That's how that works. But again, still based on kind of cycles with the different animals kind of cycling through, and then, you have another cycle. And of course, other cultures too, like the Mayans. We were all very interested in the Mayan cyclical calendar. What was that, 2012, when all that drama was, about, oh my God, are we going to have the apocalypse or not? We have our first super chat from Dhaka. Thank you so much. That says, ever since I was a child, I saw time as cyclical. Days of the week and months of the year would go in a circle, while years went in a spiral. Interesting. Yes, I think kind of intuitively we feel that time is cyclical, but the way we often express it in our modern world tends to be more linear. So kind of as part of our pagan practice, I think part of that is reestablishing that cyclical connection to the natural world and to the concept of time. Let's see. Okay, so now I kind of wanted to bring up another aspect of time telling that I find is interesting and might be useful to you. And this is from the Greco-Romans. It's called planetary hours and planetary days. And then after that, we're going to shift gears and look at how we conceptualize time now in a modern kind of secular context. So we can kind of see the difference here. But first, planetary hours and planetary days I find really interesting and really useful for anyone who might also be interested in occultism or witchcraft or things like that. But this is basically a Greco-Roman system. Obviously, our concept of astrology kind of comes from the Greeks, though earlier the Babylonians and the Egyptians kind of had their own versions of this. But what we think of, astrology, that's mostly from the Greeks. But with the Greeks and the Romans, they had the 7 classical planets. And these are what you can see with the naked eye. because obviously they didn't have telescopes. They could only see what they could see with their eyes. And comment if you know these 7 classical planets. Put them in the comments. Pop quiz. Let's see if you can do it. But 2 of them are actually not planets. The other 5 are. But what they would call the 7 classical planets, each was given a particular day and certain times of the day to rule over. So we have Saturn, Jupiter, we have the sun, which is obviously not a planet, but the Greeks kind of viewed it as such, Mars, Mercury, the moon. So we have these 7 ones. You can see them with your eyes when you're just looking out at the night sky, assuming you don't have that much light pollution. And they used these planets to kind of formulate a system of time that I think is really unique and worth learning about. So each of these planets is given rule over a particular day of the week and a certain time in the day. Now, what's interesting about planetary hours and what makes it different from our normal hours on a clock is that it's based on sunrise and sunset. So planetary hours change as the year goes on, right? Because in winter, days are shorter. Planetary hours are shorter. In summer, days are longer. Planetary hours are longer. So you're splitting the day based on how many hours are in that day between sunrise and sunset. So even though you can kind of look at it in this clock system, the clock itself is always evolving and changing because it is always relative to that sunrise and sunset, which is such a primal part of how we intuitively connect with time and how we intuitively understand when is the time to work and when is the time to rest. So that's kind of the main difference between planetary hours and planetary time versus a normal clock time system. I do have a link down below that can show you a chart of planetary days and hours. But basically, each day of the week was also given a ruling planet. We'll see if you can guess what these are. They're not too tricky, especially if you're a bit familiar with French. You should be able to guess these ones quite easily. But Monday, that's an easy one. Monday is Moon Day. So the planet associated with Monday is the moon. So moon magic could occur on a Monday. Of course, you can also do moon magic based on the cycles of the moon, but you get the idea. Tuesday, we have Mars. And Wednesday, we have Mercury. Thursday, Jupiter. Friday, Venus. Saturday, Saturn. Sunday, Sun. So you get how we kind of end up with the names of these days of the week. In part, at least. It's the days of the week in English are a combination of Norse and this kind of planetary Greco-Roman system. What's kind of interesting, though, anyone who studied Japanese might note that there's a lot of similarities here between like the kanji or the symbols in Japanese or even Chinese, like Monday having the symbol for moon, or Tuesday having the symbol for fire. Tuesday's Mars Day. So that's neat too. And I wonder if there was any trade or crossover, or if that just kind of came into being, right? Like, was that just a universal intuitive understanding that Tuesday is Mars Day, Tuesday is Fire Day, Wednesday is Mercury Day, Wednesday is Water Day, Monday is Moon Day. I just wonder these things a lot. But you can kind of see now how you could develop a magical system that incorporates planetary days and hours. Here's how you could do it, for example, in case you want to try something out. So say you wanted to do a love spell or a self-love spell, something like that. What day of the week to do it? Well, Friday, right? Friday would be a good day because it is the day of Venus. And if you want to get extra special, do it in the hour of Venus, which I believe is like the 8th hour after sunrise. So can you imagine doing a love spell on the day of Venus, in the hour of Venus, using an herb that you harvested on the day and hour of Venus? There you're kind of having a triple whammy of planetary connection with your magical working. So I think there's a lot you can do if you are into spell work, ritual, things like that, even ceremonial magic that incorporates this Greco-Roman system of planetary days and hours. Of course, you don't have to do that. You don't always have to be conscious of the planetary days and hours. But if you're really nerdy and want to get into it, you can totally go all the way with planetary hours and harvest certain herbs during the correct hour on the correct day. So there's a lot of fun to be had when you look at this system of time. But again, this system of time and understanding the hours of the day is based on sunrise and sunset. And it's also based on whatever the planets are doing, right? So it has this kind of inherent spiritual connection because, of course, the planets aren't just planets in a Greco-Roman system. They are also gods. They are the deities. Versus when we look at the hours of the day, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the clock, they don't have any spiritual connection. They're not connected to sunrise, sunset necessarily. And they don't change regardless of what time of year it is. And they're not really connected to any kind of spiritual core. Let me know if you have any experience with planetary hours or planetary days of the week. It's something I am just now starting to get involved in. And it's something I'm going to be hopefully doing a lot more of, especially as I'm working on my witch's garden, and I'm going to start harvesting and sowing on certain days based on those planetary hours. But let me see what you guys have to say. Oh, Elva has an interesting note that says the 7 planets were known by the Babylonians during the first Babylonian dynasty, so about 1,000 years before the classical Greek period. And thank you for that correction. Yes, while we nowadays most commonly associate these 7 heavenly spheres, as they call them, with the Greeks, that is giving a bit of a discredit to the Babylonians and the cradle of civilization between the Tigris and the Euphrates and the ancient cities of Babylon and Sumer, things like that. So yes, good point. Let's see, what else do we have here? Olivia says in the comments, correspondences can be so fun and also confusing. Yes, that's why us pagans and witches, we got to be nerds. That's just part of the game. And no one's going to give you an easy answer. You got to do a lot of research. Okay, let's see. Question here from Never Ending Folklore. Did Freya become Venus? I think you're asking that because of the day of Friday, right? The day of Friday is associated with Venus. But the word Friday actually does not come from Freya's day, but from Freyd's day. But there's some debate there. I go over that whole debate in a previous Pagan Happy Hour on Norse stuff. But yeah, that's interesting too, because why is Friday always the day associated with the goddess of love and beauty? Maybe there's something there. I don't know about you, but even in a modern day context, Friday is the day that I like to maybe go out to dinner, wear a cute outfit. So even in a purely secular context, there's almost a remnant of using the day of Friday to celebrate a little bit, to enjoy the sensual side of life. So interesting point. Let's see. Joey's asking what my view is on astrology. So I am not a expert on astrology by any means. Sometimes I find it useful, sometimes I don't. Um, I'm not really one into horoscopes. I do think there is something there when we look at the ancient occult concept of as above, so below. What is happening in our lives and what is happening within ourself is reflected on the outside and within the heavens. So there is this kind of connection between the universe and ourselves, the planets and ourselves and the planets. So it's not so much that the planets are affecting what happens to us, it's more like a mirror. They're mirroring what is happening here on Earth. At least that's my concept right now. It may change with the time, the more I learn about the system. So, good question. Okay. Oh, Wednesday Robinson has another good cycle of time. She mentions the moon cycles and how on waxing moon you plant things that grow above ground, waning. Oh, and then, yes. So sorry, I read that wrong. But yeah, that's a good point there, that you can also plant and harvest based on cycles of the moon. That being a really important cycle to our ancient pagan ancestors as well, and a cycle for us modern people to start connecting with more. It's obviously a super kind of witchy thing to do rituals on SBADs or new moon, full moon celebrations, things like that. So that's all part of the process of relearning our natural connection to the cycles of the moon. It can be really powerful, especially if you are a woman, in that the cycles of the moon reflect our menstrual cycles. So there's kind of this sacred feminine connection there, I think. But yeah, so we talked about planetary cycles, and we talked about Greco-Roman systems. We talked about Babylonian, Egyptian, sunrise, sunset, astrology, all of these kind of ancient pagan systems of understanding time and how it fits into our lives and our spiritual lives. So now I want to shift gears, now that we're about halfway through Pagan Happy Hour, and shift to talking about machine time or clock time, the time that we operate under now, and how that is different, I think at least, from how our pagan ancestors connected with time. And I'm going to be really curious on your perspectives on this too. Because obviously I'm not an expert here. I'm just drinking a glass of wine, sharing my 2 cents. So I want to hear your thoughts and ideas as well. But I think it's unusual and interesting that almost every aspect of our modern contemporary lives operates on machine time or clock time, right? We always know what time it is, whether you have a watch on your wrist, you're looking at your phone, you have a job to go to, you have an event to go to. Everything is basically based on a clock. But clocks weren't invented until like 300, 400 years ago as we know them today. So it's quite unusual that this invention took hold in such a strong way to pull us away from natural systems like the wheel of the year and sunrise, sunset. So unlike pagan time, machine time or clock time isn't fluid at all. It does not change with the sunrise and sunset. Planetary hours are longer or shorter based on sunrise, sunset. The hours in the day, 60 seconds to the minute, 60 minutes to the hour, that never changes. It's not based on sunrise, sunset. And it, for the most part, does not change based on the wheel of the year. You can make a small argument here that it does because of daylight savings time, but a lot of places aren't acknowledging daylight savings time anymore, and that's pretty minor to begin with. So I would say basically it's never fluid. Clock time is universal. We can tell time, we can organize events across any culture and any country, right? Because we can all understand how to read time, how to operate within this machine time. I have a super chat here from Teresa. Thank you so much. That says an interesting book for folks in the US is Keeping Watch, A History of American Time by Michael O'Malley. Thank you for that book recommendation. That does sound like an interesting one. The whole history of timekeeping is really neat and something I don't know that much about. So I might be checking out that book because that does sound neat. Let's see what you guys have to say. Wandering Dog here says, the age of industrialization changed time perception so much. The invention of the light bulb, the clock, etc. The need to further capitalism, it all ties in. Yes, and that brings up a great point too. We haven't been talking about the invention of electricity and the light bulb, but that removed the need to rest when the sun went down, as it is behind me right now. When the sun went down for people without electricity, it was a necessity. You had to rest. There was no more work to be done. This was a quiet time. This was a peaceful time of rest. With the invention of electricity, that changed. You could still technically be working in the middle of the night. And yes, the age of industrialization has a huge part to play with this. Let's see, what else do we have from you guys? Okay, let's see. Carbon Forms says, I think railroads really broke us from ancient time. They needed standardized time across large land masses. Before, clocks may have been set to solar noon in each town. Yes, exactly. The railroad system actually did have a huge part to play in the shift from pagan time to machine time. Also, the whole factory system as well, too. I was thinking about this the other day and reflecting on the American school system, for example, and how when you were back in school, and I don't know about you, but I was always looking up at the clock above the door, counting down the minutes until the class would be over and the bell would ring. And once the bell rings, that means, oh, hey, it's lunchtime. So we're tuned in to looking at the clock, hearing those cues of when to clock in and clock out. When are we working? When are we resting? When are we eating? All based on the clock. And that's drilled into us at such an early age. I mean, one of the things we do in school pretty early on is learn how to read time, right? Because we have to do that because so much of our society is based on that concept of reading time. So as we're a kid in school, what we're ultimately being trained to do with this whole idea of clocking in and clocking out, going to class at certain times of the day, eating at certain times of the day, recess at certain times of the day, we're learning how to operate our entire lives of working, eating, resting, enjoyment, all based on the clock, which is a natural transition to becoming a factory worker or a worker within just kind of the capitalist system. So it gets really deep when you start thinking about it. That's why you need to have a glass of wine when you're talking about time. Let's see here. Daka has a super chat for me. Thank you so much. Let's see. Yes. So this goes really deep. And I think that when you look into it more and more, you realize how much of this capitalist system has facilitated the need for clock time being ever more and more focused and relevant in our everyday existence, every little bit of the day. Like, can you imagine living a day and not looking at the clock. Like how weird and difficult that would be if you just, no alarm clock, no phone, no watch. You woke up when the light naturally came in through your window. You ate when you naturally felt hungry, not because it was 9 a.m. and you had to eat something before you started work, or not because it was noon and it was your lunch hour, but just naturally when you felt hungry. You worked until you were exhausted, needed to take a rest. Maybe the sun starts going down and you start winding down, and you go to bed when it's dark. That's completely different than how we live our lives. I'm not saying that we should go back to fully living under pagan time, but I do think it's an interesting reflection to have, to think about how much clock time affects almost every single thing we do. Let me see what you guys have here. Aaron is saying in the comments, I'd love to live somewhere remote where there were no clocks nor need for clocks. Yeah, that could be an interesting experience. Let's see. Wednesday Robinson is saying you have to go to the train museum in Chattanooga, Tennessee. They go into how the stopwatch came about. I have been there. I was born in Chattanooga. It's really interesting stuff. Let's see. Oh, you guys have so many good points and perspectives on this. Joey Anderson is saying, I feel like people in the modern day who have access to modern technology are too used to using clock time in some way, shape, or form. I would not mind going a day without a clock, though. Yeah, it could be a really good experience. And if you have a day off, it might be something interesting to try. Kind of removing the clock from your life for a whole day and see how you connect with it. I think it's interesting too that because we all operate under clock time, our days and tasks are always the same every day throughout the entirety of the year. Like, for example, say you're a Walmart cashier. Well, Walmart opens and closes every single day at the same time, right? So it doesn't matter if it's the middle of winter and you barely have any sunlight at all. It's still open at, say, 6 in the morning in pitch black. That's when it opens. That's when you start work, and you end at, say, 7 p.m. or wherever. But the point is, it's always opened and closed at the exact same time. Your daily routine does not change based on sunrise, sunset, agricultural system, or even stage of life you're in, right? Because in ancient societies, the elders of the community had different roles. Once you entered into a new stage of life, your life would change. It was different. What your job was different. Even when you look at the whole triple goddess concept of maiden, mother, crone, 3 very different lifestyles being represented, 3 very different chores and tasks that you would complete based on the time of the year and your particular stage in life. But under our modern system, it doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what time of year it is, what time the sun rose. You're going to be doing these same tasks day to day. So in that way, there's no natural variation, and there's no way to kind of remind yourself that you're, connected to the natural world. Now, compare this to like a farmer. Say you have an apple orchard, right? You can't harvest your apples based on a timeline. Literally, the tree tells you when to harvest the apples, right? You can't impose any system on the tree, the tree will blossom and create the fruit when it's ready, and it's going to tell you when it's ready to be harvested. So it's a completely opposite system. The farmer has to listen to the natural world, has to listen to the spirit of the tree itself, the apple tree, as guidance for when to harvest. It can't be based on the clock system. And the tree itself is growing and thriving on its own timeline, in its own way. And the farmer can only do so much to try and get it into a, more consistent timeline. But ultimately, the tree makes the choice. The tree has agency there on when it's going to be producing the fruit. Completely opposite to how the vast majority of our jobs are, where we perform a task and the task is always the same for the most part, regardless of what time and day of the week. I remember being really kind of weirded out after graduating college and entering the job force, because when you are in school, all the way at a very early age, like kindergarten, all the way through college, your year is punctuated by seasonal time offs, right? You would have a week in December off, or Christmas week. Usually you would have like some spring break type week off. You would have the summer off. So in a way, when you were in the school system, it was kind of this transitional time. On the one hand, you were learning how to live by clock time, but there were also times of the year that were connected to the season. Summer, right? Summer's off. Like, that was a huge thing in our lives growing up. And then once you graduate and you get your first job, you realize, oh, there are no breaks that we're all going on. There's no spring break. There's no summer break. There's no week off in December. There's often no holidays off. And it's a complete removal then from looking at our schedules from a seasonal perspective. And then we live our lives from that point on to the end, operating fully in this clock time where it's only the job that matters. It's never your stage of life. It's never the time of day. It's never the wheel of the year, the season. It's always getting the work done in a routine fashion. So I think that's kind of interesting, and that we've agreed to operate our adult lives under the system without much protest, it seems. And I do think as time goes on more and more into the future, clock time infiltrates our lives more and more. You can look at that from the idea of like smartwatches and stuff like that. We're always aware of your time. You're always aware of your obligations, and it's very difficult to separate yourself from kind of the wider world. It's just once you're sucked into the clock time, I feel like it's really difficult to try out something new, to reconnect with those cycles that we have been connected to for millennia. And then that brings up the question, and I see Leah here in the comments, how can we change this, right? That's the question I want to ask you guys, because I don't know. But what would the world look like if we started operating more on pagan time and less on machine time? What would our daily lives be like? Yes, it would create complete chaos within our current system. Our current system would probably collapse. It wouldn't be good in many regards. Maybe from a spiritual sense, it would, though. It would connect us more to what's ultimately important in our lives and what ultimately has value and meaning to us. So I think it's just a really interesting question to ask, what would our world look like if we started operating under pagan time and less under clock time? And is that a world we want to start moving back towards, or maybe not? What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. Desmano says, if you think about the seasons, they actually do control our lives more than you think. Entire industries are controlled by them. Like, for instance, the entire retail industry changes their stock in stores with the seasons. And yes, you bring up a good point, though I would say this is actually changing and has changed fairly recently. It used to be you would have fall fashion and spring fashion, the fall fashion week and spring fashion week as the main fashion week times. But nowadays, the like big box stores, like, they have new clothes every single week. So there's really like 52 fashion weeks. So even that is starting to shift away from seasonality and more towards just something new each week. But yeah, you bring up a good point there, that there are still some aspects of seasonality, but I do think that even that is starting to shift away. Wilding Up North says that if we shifted more towards pagan time, the world would look a lot more mentally healthy. Yes, I can only speak from personal experience, but when I started connecting more with the Wheel of the Year, when I started celebrating the different pagan holidays on the Wheel of the Year, when I started purposefully trying to notice the changes in my natural environment as the seasons changed, I myself started to have better mental health. So I don't know if it's the same for you guys. I don't want to say it's a cure-all, but that has been my experience, that reconnecting with the Wheel of the Year I found to be very positive for my mental health. Jenna is saying, this is something I've thought about when signing my daughter up for school this year. I want to homeschool and keep her on some sort of pagan time. Ooh, that's an interesting concept. Yeah, that could be a really neat thing to try if you're up for it. I'd be curious to see how it goes. I personally don't have kids of my own, though I have thought if I did, it would be kind of fun to homeschool them and try and see how I could develop a bit of a pagan curriculum alongside just the normal education as well, and what that might look like. Let's see. Michael says pagan time on the week times, clock time during the weeks. And, I think that might be a good approach there. I mean, obviously, most of us have day jobs. We have to clock in and clock out within the secular capitalist world that we live in. But the time that you have off, that is your own time. So maybe trying to start by incorporating pagan time, turning off those clocks, trying to pay attention to sunrise, sunset, and the cycles of the year during that weekend time could be a really good way to kind of ease into this new way of living. Yeah, you guys are bringing up so many good thoughts and ideas. And let's see, we just have a few minutes left. So now is a great time to throw your questions in the chat, share anything, any ideas you might have about this concept. If you did enjoy this episode, if you do enjoy my channel, of course, it would be great if you were wanting to do a super chat or join the Patreon, anything to support the channel, or even just subscribe and hit that like button. That helps a ton. But let me know what you guys have to say in the comments. Let me see here. Okay. Let's see. Shin in the comments is saying, I think more people would genuinely be happier if we operated under pagan time. and that everyone is different, and how individuals react to certain times and seasons can be restricting or liberating depending on how we choose to connect with time. Good point. Yeah. Let's see. I can see a few of you guys have really enjoyed this topic. I was a bit surprised, honestly, that y'all picked this in the poll yesterday, because it was kind of a more obscure philosophical concept. But I think it's been a pretty interesting discussion, so I'm glad it seems you guys have enjoyed it. But I think it's something that we can continue to talk and discuss as our lives shift more and more and more into this kind of rigid, structured clock time. We pagans have to come up with strategies and ideas and share thoughts on how we ourselves, at least, can keep a semblance of pagan time. So I do hope we continue to have these discussions in the future. And I do want to thank you guys so much for joining me, even though it's a Thursday and not my usual pagan happy hour day. I will be back on schedule for next week for Friday pagan happy hour. And I see Lily Bell's joined us in the corner there, just ready to sign off. But thank you all so much again. Please do hit that like and subscribe button if you are enjoying the show. And I will see you all next week. Talk to you then. Bye.